Well, it's not the GBNews Tavern in Paddington, but we're here in Westminster, and it is Talking Pints. And after a long day, my guest tonight, Tony Smith, I don't know how many interviews you've done today, Tony, but you could probably do with a drink, couldn't you?
I could indeed, Nigel.
Well,
thank you very much.
Welcome to Talking Pints.
Thank you very much for inviting
not
me.
one
I
little bit.
Could do with a drink, yes, indeed.
Now, this has been your whole career.
Yeah.
And it's still your career, and you're now, you're outside the Home Office after 40 years, but you're giving advice and strategic global advice and security advice and all of those things. So was it 1972?
Yeah.
You started off.
I did indeed, Nigel. I worked in the aliens branch.
Can you imagine that word being used today?
No, I can't actually. But I was a young lad. I went straight into the business from school. Didn't go to university. Didn't really know what I wanted to do. Asked for the civil service and just ended up in the aliens branch, deciding whether or not aliens could stay or not. They were already in the country by then. I was doing extensions.
What defined an alien?
It was someone who wasn't a Commonwealth citizen, basically. So the aliens files were green and the Commonwealth files were yellow. And Commonwealth citizens, I mean, it wasn't very long before I started at Heathrow that Commonwealth citizens were being waved through the UK border, actually, Nigel. And we were just stopping aliens. And some of my early refusers were young European men who were coming here ostensibly as visitors, but really to try and get employment, to protect the labour market. Of course, fast forward 20 years and we're waving through Europeans and actually refusing entry to Commonwealth citizens. So, I mean, it's just gone. It's gone. It keeps going round and round, Nigel.
Circle. Yeah. No, it has. And you've documented all of this. You've got a book out.
I have got a book out, Nigel, and I did bring you a copy, and I did write in there for you because you've interviewed not just you, lots of journalists have interviewed, but I did say that, Nigel, for everything that you always wanted to know about immigration and borders, but were never afraid to ask.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'll be having a good read of that. Changing borders, but it is interesting, isn't it? You talk about 1972, as you say. Obviously the situation with Europe changed fundamentally, but for the first 20 years we didn't notice, did we? Because for the first 20 years, some of us went to work in Europe, some Europeans came to work here. Wasn't really, was it, until the 1990s that we saw a lot of French people coming to London, and then of course it was in the noughties, wasn't it, when the former communist countries joined, that we saw that really, really big change.
Yeah, that was a very big changing point, actually, Nigel, when we did allow it's called, I think, the expansion or the accession of the A8.
A8 to begin with,
and then it was the A2 after that.
There was the A8, and then we had Bulgaria, Romania that joined a few years later.
And you know what? I mean, just shortly before that, I can remember we were still actually arresting people from A8 countries and deporting them here because they were working illegally, and someone just said, "Look, you better stop doing that." But as from tomorrow, actually, they're allowed to come freely. And don't worry, there'll only be a few thousand on the coaches at Victoria. It'll be about 8,000, someone said.
13,000. Blair's government said 13,000 a year, and it was hundreds of thousands a year.
Yeah, I mean, we had that on the first day, I think.
Yeah, it was just completely out of control.
Yeah.
But just take you back again. So how did we used to do this? Because today the big subject, I mean, we could talk about legal immigration, and we could talk about the fact the population's risen by 8 million this century, etc. Yeah. But it's illegal immigration that the Prime Minister is talking about today, and Priti Patel's out in Rwanda. How did you, as a young officer engaged in this business, how did you deal with people coming to Britain illegally?
So I cut my teeth on the Immigration Act of 1971, which came into force on 1/1/73.
Yeah.
Just around the time I was joining, but that was probably the most draconian looking back piece of legislation because it gave me huge powers, Nigel. I mean, some powers that I wasn't aware were so huge, but actually as an immigration officer I was empowered to decide whether or not you entered the country. So when you came to my desk at the airport, if I checked your passport, I was trained to look out for forgeries and dodgy passports and things, and if you had a dodgy passport, well then I would send you straight back on the first plane you arrived on by serving you with a notice and serving the airline with a notice, and then we would keep you at the airport and you'd go straight, same with the ferry ports really. And then when we got into illegal entry, the same thing applied. If we found people that were coming up the beaches illegally, then they were liable to detention.
And did that sort of thing happen in those days?
Yes. In fact, there was an amnesty, I remember, back in the 70s for illegal entrance, and quite a lot of overstayers tried to pretend they'd entered illegally to get into the amnesty. So I remember all that quite well. There were illegal entrants, but the powers we had were probably, when you think about that now, draconian. But yes, I didn't...
And that's vested in you, and they had no right to call a lawyer or anything like that?
No, it was upon the authority of my chief. So if I wanted to refuse anybody, I had to get a second pair of eyes, which was my chief, who would second guess my decision. And if they had an entry clearance or a work permit, they got a right of appeal before removal. But generally, that's what I cut my teeth on for the first 20 years or so. What happened after that was this sort of huge asylum intake that we got. It started in the 90s, and I was here actually in the noughties, 2002. We had 100,000, Nigel, arrived and it was a lot worse than now because they were actually camping on the beaches in Dover. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
Huge investment. We had to triple the Home Office budget. In fact, I was on an attachment to Canada and came back and we tripled the budget. I mean, I couldn't come back at the same time. Tony, all the people that used to work for you have all been promoted. I mean, we've had this massive asylum directorate created, and we didn't have any computers, Nigel. This was all paper. So there was a paper interview, which we'd write down, keep at the port, a pink file, and then there was another green one in the Home Office, and the paperwork just mounted up and up. We have got an iron mountain of files down in Hayes where all these files were kept. But actually, we simply sunk under, and so I still think we've never really recovered in the Home Office from the backlogs that grew because became
the not fit for purpose Home Office.
Oh, John Reid came in and he said that we weren't fit for purpose. I remember that very, very well. And we were all put on leadership training courses, and we all went through additional, re-evaluation of ourselves. But the fundamental issue was what we'd created was this huge bureaucracy around asylum, a huge legal profession which continues to grow around asylum. So the decision making now is not at the border.
Did the Human Rights Act coming in the late 1990s, did it make a big difference in those days?
Yes, certainly, because now you weren't just talking about asylum, you were talking about a claim to human rights, and particularly Article 3 or Article 8. Now, you couldn't do these things like I used to while the passenger was in front of you, or the illegal entry on the beach. You couldn't do that there and then, because there were lots of things to consider. You had to interview the person, you had to get second check, so it was a longer process. You couldn't hold people, Nigel, for all of that time. You granted temporary admission. So they'd be given a piece of paper, so that you go and live, if you knew someone here, you go and live with them. If you don't know somebody here, well, we'll find somewhere. That's when the asylum accommodation boom began, and still goes. I mean, we heard today about 5 million, was it, in hotels now?
A day.
So so that's what happened. So people are now in the community. They haven't really got status. They don't know what's going to happen to themselves, and the Home Office is struggling to keep up. But even when they do get to, I remember doing a presentation to Jack Straw's special advisor, and I drew a race course about, if you really want to achieve removals, you've got to get over these hurdles of refusal, appeal, judicial review, documentation, whatever, and then even when you don't get to the winning post because you can go round again because something happens, a relationship develops or something else. So it's a perennial cycle of casework that has been the problem, and successive governments have tried to bring in things like the new asylum model or frivolous and vexatious claims, third country removals, lots and lots of things done by governments of all colours, Nigel. I'm going back right the way back to, when we had the Blair government, actually, we had tipping the balance. Do you remember that?
I do. Yeah. I do. How do you, Tony, for people at home, how would you as a professional in this industry, how do you define a genuine refugee as opposed to somebody who's an economic migrant? Because that really is the crux, isn't it, of much of this debate?
Yeah, and it's really hard because you haven't got very good evidence to go on other than what they tell you when they arrive. You haven't got third-party evidence. You certainly don't have any documentary evidence. If there are no records of this person, how do you know actually whether or not? So you say, well, this is where this is the account that you have given. You've then got researchers in the Home Office will look at the country you say you came from. Were you really involved in that thing that happened at that time or not? So it's a very, very difficult process. But I do think it's right to distinguish people, Nigel, who have been out of their homeland for a long, long time, for some time now, that have been living in a safe third country. And I think that's what they're trying to do now. We went over with the BBC Kent crew to Calais just before Christmas, and we interviewed a chap who feared persecution in Iran, but he left Iran 15 years ago. He'd been around Europe, he's applied for visas for everywhere, and he told his friends to us, look, come to Calais, the way in there is to get a boat. Yeah. He got a text from his friend in Cambridge who was working in a kebab shop, and he honestly thought, this is if I can't get a visa, this is what I need to do. So it's an education process. Actually, there are options for you. He did get asylum status eventually in France, I think long residence concession in France, we've been there so long. But there are options for you to stay where you are. You don't all have to come to the UK, actually, although you may want to. So there's a difference between wanting to come to the UK and what are we going to do about the 80 million people that are displaced. And I think you're right. We have done some good things around Ukraine, some good things about Afghanistan. I think the UK has been up front and centre. What the Prime Minister is saying, you can't have both tracks.
No.
You've got a track of resettlement,
and that
which
made
we
sense
invest
today,
in,
what he said, didn't
but
it?
you can't invest more in this bit if you're continuing to allow. And then the smugglers and the drownings, don't get me started on that.
I mean, you were there today at Lyd, weren't you?
Yeah, I was there, yeah.
You were there watching him, and it was no doubt said with some degree of sincerity. But I tell you what, the question: people are having a pint in pubs and clubs all over Britain tonight.
Yeah, good idea.
Because they're going to be chatting in bars tonight, and they're going to be saying, will this make the difference? Will this work? Because you and I both know that whatever you get in Westminster from politicians and media, out there in the real country, what's happening across the Channel is provoking real anger. Real anger, a sense of unfairness, a sense of, hey, this is not what Brexit Britain was supposed to be about. So the real question is this going to work? Are these proposals that have been put forward today actually going to work?
Yeah, I've been asked that all day, Nigel, and the truthful answer
This is the last time you'll be asked.
I'll probably ask again tomorrow. The truthful answer is I don't know. And I don't think you know, I don't think anyone knows. I think what we can say, there is an intent now for it to work. Before today, there wasn't any. I couldn't see anything. I agree with the previous speaker. You know, the lawyer. Really, we need to deal with the EU. You're right. Why have we not got a safe third with France or the EU? I mean, we come on, let's be sensible. We've got people drowning on a joint waterway between our two countries. And you know I've advocated joint patrols, safe third, all of that stuff. You know I've worked with the French, and I've got a lot of time for them. They don't like smugglers. You know, in the Carte de Calais, they don't like smugglers, and they want to work with us on these things. The French enforcement agents. This is political. This is political because they will not agree for a safe third country agreement. France is a safe third country. People are not fleeing from France. And that's the premise upon which the Dublin Convention was set up, which I remember Dublin 1 back in the 90s. It's to stop what we called asylum shopping, because we found people were claiming and just running from country to country, and then we set up the Eurodac system, so we could say, well, actually, you've already claimed asylum, you've refused asylum in Belgium. Why have you come here and claimed it again? This is not a game.
Well, what do we do? Because, you know, we know that 90% of those that cross the Channel are men, 70% young men, single men. None of them have passports. We can't check who they are. What do we do?
Well, we've
got to try and solve this. And if Rwanda's not going to work, is it possible that we can do what the Australians did? Is it possible we can pick these people up and take them straight back to Indonesia, as it was in Australia's case, or France in our case? Can it be done?
I think it can be done. And the Australian model proves that it can be done, because they did use Nauru for this purpose and other islands. But you're right, they got a lot of criticism for it. I'm sure the scrutineers will be all over Rwanda like a rash tonight. And tomorrow morning there'll be all kinds of stories. I don't know enough about Rwanda to say what, but I'd be surprised if a bunch of civil servants have not been out there for a long, long time trying to dot the I's and cross the T's to make sure that that is tied down and that you won't see that. But you're right, you know, that there will be an immediate challenge. The moment the Home Office tries to do, there'll be a legal challenge to this process. There'll be a judicial review which can run on for several months, if not years. And whilst that process, we will not be allowed, Nigel, to. I had to stop removals to Greece and Italy because a judge once said that they haven't got a safe asylum system there. So we were sending a lot of people back there. And that year I was told, well, you're not doing your job properly, Tony, because you're not sending people. It wasn't my fault. I mean, it's because there was an injunction that prevented me from sending people back there.
I have to say, Tony Smith, it does sound to me like, in many ways, it was all much easier, much more straightforward, even if it was a touch draconian. But back in 1972, we knew exactly what we were doing. We knew where we stood for. Are we ever going to get back to that sense of surety?
I don't think so, Nigel. We live in a changed world now, don't we? And I do really sympathise with refugees. I get beaten up a lot for saying I've got no sympathy for migrants. For refugees, I have got utmost sympathy. And I've seen people brought here and we have sent teams into Africa and brought people out of really difficult places. And it's the heartwarming side of the business, Nigel. When you really are bringing somebody out of a dreadful, dreadful situation. and doing your bit. You know, you're proud, so proud that you've resettled someone. So that's the really heartwarming side of the business, but you can't have one without the other. And I think that's where we've lost our way a little bit. It'd be nice to be able to do that for everybody and perhaps not even have a border.
Yeah,
but wait a minute, you know, let's live in the real world, Nigel.
Well,
you know, as you know.
I want to say I'm going to look forward to changing borders.
Thank you.
Bit of a plug for you.
Thank you, Nigel.
And I can look forward to that. And thanks for joining me on Talking Pints.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Nigel.
Appreciate
Pleasure
it.
to talk to you.
And thanks for the work you've done for the country.
Thank you very much. Cheers.